She didn't even look at him. That was the first thing that stopped Caleb Thorne cold. Every woman in that lantern-lit yard had spent weeks preparing for this moment, new dresses pressed, hair pinned just so, practice smiles aimed straight at him like loaded rifles. But the woman standing near the kitchen door in a plain gray dress wasn't looking at anyone. She was stacking empty platters with the quiet efficiency of someone who had long since stopped expecting the night to hold anything for her. And then Margaret Whitfield did something that made half the room go silent. She stepped directly into the girl's path, plucked a platter from her hands without so much as a glance, and said loudly enough for 3 tables to hear, "The help doesn't linger near the guests, dear. You know where you belong." The girl didn't flinch, didn't argue, just nodded once, the way a person nods when they've been told the same cruel thing so many times it no longer requires a reaction. That quiet, practiced nod was the moment everything changed. If you've ever been made to feel invisible in a room full of people, if you know what it's like to work twice as hard and still be looked through like glass, then this story is going to stay with you. Before we go any further, if you're new here, please take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. And while you're watching, drop a comment and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button too. It means more than you know. Now, let's go back to Ironwood Crossing. The annual cattle season dance was the closest thing Ironwood Crossing had to a royal court. It happened every year in the wide, hard-packed yard between the freight office and the old grain store, strung with lanterns that swayed when the wind came off the plains. Fiddles started at sundown. The smell of roasting meat and fresh bread drifted through the evening air. Children chased each other between adults' legs until they were scooped up and sent to sleep in wagon beds. And the adults, the ranchers, the merchants, the ambitious fathers and their carefully dressed daughters all arranged themselves around the edges of the yard in the careful, strategic way that had nothing to do with dancing and everything to do with business. The Thorne family was Ironwood Crossing's closest thing to royalty. Not because Silas Thorne had been born into anything he hadn't. He'd arrived with $63 and a mule that died 2 weeks after he got there. What he'd built out of that, nothing, was the kind of story people told their children to make them believe effort meant something. And what he'd built eventually included the biggest cattle operation in 3 territories, a private water agreement that kept half the town from dying in dry summers, and a son named Caleb who, at 28, had somehow managed to inherit his father's work ethic without inheriting his father's ruthlessness. Caleb didn't love these dances. He'd told his father that plainly every year, and every year Silas told him that a man who owned what the Thornes owned didn't have the luxury of staying home because he found socializing tiresome. "It's not tiresome," Caleb had said once, when he was maybe 22 and still arguing things he knew he'd lose. "It's just the same conversation wearing different hats." Silas had looked at him over his coffee cup, then smile anyway. So Caleb smiled. He arrived on time, shook the hands that needed shaking, accepted the whiskey someone always pressed on him within the first 10 minutes, spent the rest of the evening navigating around daughters who found him considerably more interesting than he found them, not because they were bad women, but because there was something exhausting about being wanted for what you owned rather than who you were. He'd gotten skilled at the polite deflection, the slightly too long handshake that let him step sideways out of a conversation. The way he'd angle his body toward the food table when a father started steering a daughter in his direction. It wasn't mean-spirited. He just knew the difference between someone wanting to talk to him and someone working up to a point. He was in the middle of executing exactly that maneuver, edging away from a conversation with Randolph Gates and his eldest daughter, who kept touching her own hair nervously when he saw her. She was near the kitchen door of the boarding house, which backed up against the east side of the dance yard. A young woman in a gray dress that had clearly been washed so many times the color had faded to something between slate and nothing. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly, the way working women wore it when they needed to keep it out of their faces. She was carrying a stack of empty platters from the long supper tables back toward the kitchen, moving quickly, her eyes on the ground ahead of her. What caught his attention was not her appearance, it was her direction. Every single other person in that yard, every single one had their face angled toward the action, toward the gathering, toward him, or at least toward the family table where the Thornes held court by virtue of simply existing. This woman was walking away from all of it, briskly, like she had somewhere more important to be, which he supposed she did. The kitchen didn't clean itself. He watched her for a moment longer than he meant to, long enough to notice the slight tension in her shoulders, not the tension of someone rushing, but the tension of someone being careful. Like a person who had learned to take up as little space as possible. He was about to look away. That was when Margaret Whitfield moved. Margaret was the wife of Douglas Whitfield, who owned the second largest cattle operation in the territory and had never quite gotten over the fact that it was second. She was a woman who wore her social position, the way some men wore guns visibly, and always with the casual menace of someone who wanted you to know it was there. She was also, Caleb had long observed, the kind of person who was at her most dangerous when no one important was watching. She was wrong about that tonight. She stepped directly into the path of the woman in the gray dress, smoothly. You steps in front of someone when you want them to understand the step was not accidental. She reached out and lifted the top two platters from the stack with the easy authority of someone who had never once considered whether the other person might object. "The help doesn't linger near the guests, dear," she said. Not meanly, exactly. In that particular tone, that's somehow worse than mean, the tone of someone's explaining something obvious to someone they consider slightly slow. You know where you belong. The yard wasn't quiet. The fiddle was still going, and people were still talking, and children were still being children. But somehow those words landed in a pocket of relative stillness, and the 3 or 4 women nearest Margaret all heard them clearly, and 2 of them smiled just slightly. The way people smile when someone else has said the thing they were thinking, but wouldn't say. The woman in the gray dress stopped walking. She looked at Margaret for exactly 1 second, just one, and whatever was in her eyes in that second, Caleb couldn't read from where he was standing. Then she nodded, a small composed nod, took the platters back, turned and walked the rest of the way to the kitchen door without looking back. She didn't rush. She didn't hunch her shoulders. She just walked. Caleb realized his jaw was tight. He turned to look at Randolph Gates, who was still talking about the Eastern buyers coming through next spring, and he nodded at something he hadn't heard, and he thought about that nod. The one the woman in the gray dress had given. That particular quality of it, the absence of surprise in it, that was what stayed with him. She'd nodded the way someone nods at weather, not because she agreed with it, because arguing with weather has never once changed the weather. He made an excuse and stepped away from the Gates family. He didn't go toward the kitchen. He wasn't that straightforward, at least not yet. He wandered toward the edge of the yard where the lantern light thinned and found himself a place to stand where he could see the kitchen door without appearing to look at it. He wasn't sure why. Mostly he just wanted to know if she came back out. She did about 3 minutes later, carrying a fresh pitcher of cider for one of the tables. She moved the way she'd moved before, efficient, quiet, careful. She set the pitcher down, exchanged 6 words with an older man at the table who appeared to be thanking her for something, and nodded again. Same nod, practical and unexplaining. Then she turned, and for just a moment, she was facing his direction, and he could actually see her face properly in the lantern light. She was younger than he'd estimated, 24, maybe 25. The kind of face that might have been beautiful if it had any softness in it, but it didn't, not from meanness, but from the same thing that made her walk so carefully. Like she'd organized herself into something manageable and wasn't sure it would hold together if she let any part of it relax. Her eyes were dark and direct in the way eyes get when a person has learned to see things coming before they arrive. Those eyes landed on him for exactly as long as it took her to register that he was a person standing at the edge of the yard. And then she looked away, completely, back toward the kitchen. No recognition, no curiosity, certainly no interest. He found himself unreasonably bothered by this. Not in a wounded way, he wasn't so foolish or so vain as that. But bothered in the specific way you feel when something doesn't behave the way everything in your experience has led you to expect it to behave. Women at these dances always saw him, even the ones pretending not to. This one's had looked through him like he was a fence post and gone back to thinking about whatever she thought about. He crossed the yard slowly. Not toward her, she'd gone back inside, but generally in that direction. Enough that when she came back through the kitchen door with a stack of clean rags for the spill someone had made at the far table, they were close enough that he could have started a conversation without raising his voice. "The cider's good," he said. She glanced at him the way you glance at a stranger who speaks to you unexpectedly. Quick and assessing, then she said, "The Braden family brings it. They've been making it the same way for 15 years, and kept walking toward the spill table." Followed at a half step. "You know the Bradens?" "I know most people's habits," she said. "It's part of the work." She reached the spill, crouched down, and began dealing with it with the focused efficiency of someone who did not have time for conversation with people who were not actively on fire. "I'm Caleb Thorne," he said. "I know who you are," she said, without looking up. He waited. Most people, when introduced to the name Thorne, had something to say. Comments about his father, about the ranch, about the water agreement or the cattle market or the state of the territory. The woman with the rags said nothing and continued cleaning the floor with methodical care. "And you are," he tried. She finished the last corner of the spill, stood up, looked at him directly for the second time that evening, and said, "Someone who still has 6 tables to check before the night's done, mister." "Thorne," and she walked away again. He stood there for a moment, holding a conversation that had just been neatly ended without apparent hostility, and he was smiling before he knew he was smiling. Eliza. He heard an older woman, probably the boarding house keeper, call from the kitchen doorway. "Cornbread's ready." So that was her name, Eliza. He filed it away without being certain why. He found his father near the freight office wall around 9 o'clock. In the spot Silas always occupied at these things back against solid structure, good view of everything, far enough from the music to hold a conversation. His father was 61 now and wore it the way good wood wears years, harder, denser, still fundamentally sound. He had a cup of something in his hand and was watching the yard with the expression of a man who had helped build the ground. Everyone was standing on and wasn't entirely sure whether that gave him the right to feel proud or merely responsible. "You've been watching that boarding house girl," Silas said, without preamble, the way men say things when they've decided there's no point in leading up to them. Caleb leaned against the wall beside him. "She told me she had 6 tables to check." Silas was quiet for a moment. "Did you hear what Margaret Whitfield said to her?" "Yes. Half the yard heard it." "I know." His father turned his cup in his hands. The girl handled it quietly. "She's had practice," Caleb said, and he didn't mean it as a compliment to anyone who'd given her that practice. Silas looked at him sideways, not with alarm exactly, but with the particular attention of a man who has been paying careful attention to his son for 28 years and has learned to notice when the boy is thinking something he hasn't said yet. "Don't make trouble at other people's dance," Silas said finally. "I'm not making any trouble." "No," his father agreed. Not yet. They stood together in the quiet of the wall, watching the lanterns sway, while the fiddle started up something faster, and the dancers stepped into it, and the night rolled on the way nights do when you're not quite sure whether what's beginning is small or large. 3 tables away, through the kitchen window, Caleb could see the light on. He could see a figure moving efficiently in the warm yellow glow of it. Someone who still had work to do. He thought about the nod. About the 1 second she'd spent looking at Margaret Whitfield, and everything contained in that 1 second of absolute, carefully controlled restraint. He didn't know her story yet. He didn't know where she'd come from, or what she'd endured to develop that particular quality of stillness, that practiced ease with being dismissed. But he found himself, standing beside his father in the warm dark of a summer evening, deeply and specifically unwilling to forget her. And that, as it turned out, was the thing that changed everything. Part 2, Louis. Vit du 6000. 500 the lien Kate lien Mike vikak van chuk chum coachient. Befahoy twite doutain what coachient lien Mike ki gap lai. Moi van lien Mike de van chuk. Home zoithiot lai coachient adofen mui. Lien Kate kak fun kwa coachient what kijk lien Mike. Suzum coachient tip zua kak fun. Dui chi chu day. Trying ngat quang dot ngot. Kom suzum kijk do zom hok tiu de fu. Fong kak coachient mi hua ki zom van zawo kam suk. Kathio noi tu ba. Zudo kik ting kom viet lan man. Nunvit kom huan hao. Hoitwaidi tu nien. Trangon ngu van chung sao zoi va kum tu AI dien hen. Viet nunya van chuen niep kom nu AI kogang ne sang. Kyoto kan ngui. Kam mil ta qua mut ma va huan hao. Kit tuk van kom zoi tio van sao skochient kom nyak den chua. Louis Chaloi trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document, chỉ dẫn bắt buộc không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyện. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí. Không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật. Không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. Lưu ý đặc biệt quan trọng. Nếu đã đến giới hạn trả lời, không được dừng giữa câu, hãy biết nốt câu đó hoàn chỉnh không mở rộng nội dung. He went back the next morning. He told himself it was because he needed to speak with Mrs. Garner about the boarding house's laundry arrangements. The ranch hands, who stayed in town during the seasonal drive, sometimes used the house's washing service, and there was a billing question that had been sitting unresolved for about 3 weeks. Which was true. The billing question existed. He could have sent his foreman, but he didn't. He arrived at the boarding house at 7:30 when the breakfast service was still going, and Mrs. Garner met him at the front door with the particular expression of a woman who had been running a business long enough to recognize when a man's stated reason for appearing and his actual reason for appearing were different animals entirely. She was a stout woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and the kind of directness that comes from decades of managing other people's problems. Mr. Thorne, she said. The billing question. Yes, ma'am. She looked at him for a beat longer than necessary. Come through to the kitchen. I'm in the middle of something. The kitchen was warm and smelled like wood smoke and fresh bread and something savory on the back burner. Mrs. Garner had 3 things going at once on the stove, and seated at the long prep table, working her way through a mound of bread dough with the focused, slightly aggressive efficiency of someone who had learned to bake under pressure, was Eliza. She looked up when he came in. Her expression did not change in any meaningful way. It was the expression of someone who registered new information and filed it without visible reaction. The Thorne account, Mrs. Garner said to him, already moving to the small desk in the corner where she kept her ledgers. I've got your totals here from October and November. December is still running. He took the offered stool near the desk and went through the figures with her, which took about 12 minutes, which was 10 minutes longer than it needed to because Mrs. Garner was thorough and he was not in a hurry. During those 12 minutes, he was aware, in the peripheral and deliberate way of someone trying not to be obvious about paying attention, that Eliza did not look at him again. She worked the dough. She moved to the oven, checked something, moved back. She refilled her flour without spilling any. She had the compact, economical movements of someone who had worked in confined spaces for most of her life and had learned to function efficiently without bumping into things. When the billing question was settled, Mrs. Garner handed him a copy of the figures and he folded it into his pocket. "Thank you," he said. And then, because he was not by nature a dishonest man, he looked toward the prep table and said, "Good morning." Eliza looked up from the dough. "Morning," she said. Flat and polite, the way you say good morning to the man who reads the water meter. He left. He came back 4 days later, this time with an actual question about whether the house had room for 2 additional hands during the spring drive, which was 3 months away. This was a legitimate planning question. He was aware it was also convenient. He arrived at the same time as before and was shown to the kitchen again, and this time the bread was already done, and Eliza was peeling a large pot of potatoes with a paring knife, the kind of repetitive task that allowed for conversation if the other person started one. He sat across from Mrs. Garner at the desk and asked his question and got his answer, and then stayed about 5 minutes longer than the question required, drinking the coffee, Mrs. Garner pushed at him without asking whether he wanted it. At some point during those 5 minutes, Eliza said, without looking up from the potatoes, "She charges a different rate in spring." He looked at her. "For the extra hand," she said. "Spring rate's higher because the house is fuller and the water usage goes up." Mrs. Garner always forgets to say that part until the bill comes due. Mrs. Garner made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "She's not wrong." He looked at Eliza for a moment. "What's the rate?" she told him. It was a fair number. He wrote it in the margin of the paper he'd already folded into his pocket. "Good to know," he said. Eliza returned to the potatoes. He walked home in the early morning cold and found himself thinking that it was a very small thing, a practical comment about spring billing rates, and also that she'd volunteered it. That was the detail. She hadn't been required to say anything. She'd been sitting 3 feet away, doing her work, and she'd said something useful to a man she had no particular reason to help. That meant she'd been listening, which meant he wasn't entirely invisible to her. He recognized that he was reading a great deal into a comment about laundry rates and water usage. He recognized it and didn't especially care. The third visit was different because he didn't have a reason. He'd spent 2 days trying to construct one and failed, and on the third day, he was out early, checking a fence line that ran along the edge of town, and he simply stopped at the boarding house without pretending there was a question to be answered. He went around to the kitchen door, which he'd learned was the appropriate entrance at this hour, and knocked, and Eliza opened it. She was the one who answered this time, which he hadn't expected. She looked at him. She looked at the street behind him, checking, apparently, for whoever had sent him. "No one sent me," he said before she could ask. "I know that," she said. "I was looking at the weather." He stepped back and looked. It was indeed doing something complicated in the east, a bank of clouds building up dark and heavy over the plains. "Snow before noon," she said. "Probably," he agreed. She looked at him again. There was something in the look that he'd started to recognize, a kind of calculation, not cold, but serious. The look of someone who has learned to assess things accurately, because the cost of being wrong has historically been high. "Mrs. Garner's gone to the mill," she said. "I'm here alone." The way she said it was not an invitation. It was a statement of fact, offered as information relevant to whatever decision he was about to make. He took it seriously. "Then I won't come in. He stopped. He'd been about to invent something. He didn't. "I was out along the east fence, and I thought I'd stop." She considered this with the same seriousness she applied to everything. "Coffee's hot," she said finally. "You can sit on the step if you want it." "I'll bring a cup out." It was, he thought, one of the stranger offers he'd received in his life. Sitting on the back kitchen step in December, with a bank of snow coming in off the plains, was not comfortable by anyone's definition. But she was drawing a line, not mean-spirited, not coy, but practical, and he understood that the line was the point. He could have the coffee and the conversation. He couldn't come into the house when she was alone in it. Those were the terms. "That'd be good," he said. "Thank you." She brought 2 cups, which he hadn't expected either. She sat in the doorway rather than on the step, technically still inside the kitchen, technically maintaining the threshold, and wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at the weather coming in. And he sat on the top step with his back against the doorframe and did the same. They were quiet for a while, which was not uncomfortable. He'd been in enough silences with enough people to know the difference between a silence that needs filling and a silence that doesn't. "Where are you from?" he asked, eventually. "England," she said. "Village outside Bristol. You wouldn't know it." "How long have you been out here?" She thought about it. 3 years in the territory. Before that, 2 years in Saint Louis. Before that, the crossing. She said the crossing the way people say things that are over and done, and best not revisited. "Family here?" "No, just that. No apology in it. No invitation to follow up. Just the plain truth of a person who had been on her own long enough to have stopped framing it as something that required explanation." He drank his coffee. The first snowflakes were starting to come down, small and tentative still, testing the air. "I owe you an apology," he said. She glanced at him. "What?" "For coming around here with pretend reasons. The billing question was real, but I had a foreman I could have sent. The spring bunking question, I could have written a note." She looked at her coffee. Something in her jaw shifted, but it wasn't anger exactly. It was more like someone recalibrating. "Why are you telling me that?" she asked. "Because you're not stupid," he said, "and it'd be an insult to keep pretending." Quiet for a moment. The snow came down steadily now, small and dry and cold. "Most men in your position," she said slowly, not looking at him, "when they decide they want something, they don't usually bother explaining themselves to the people they want it from." "I know. So what does that make you?" He thought about it honestly. "Probably still someone to be careful of," he said. "I don't know yet. You shouldn't take my word for it." She looked at him then, really looked. The way she'd looked at Margaret Whitfield that night in the yard, that one full second of assessment. And there was something different in it this time. Not warmth, not yet, but not the shuttered blankness either. Something that was considering genuinely whether what it was looking at might be what it appeared to be. "I have bread to check," she said. "Go ahead." She got up, took her cup inside, and came back to the doorway 30 seconds later. "It's not done yet. I have another few minutes." He smiled at his coffee cup, where she couldn't see it. They talked for another 20 minutes, while the snow came down around the kitchen step, and the bread finished in the oven behind her, and he learned 3 things. That she had arrived in Ironwood Crossing the previous winter with very little money, and a letter of introduction from a woman in Saint Louis who'd known Mrs. Garner's sister, that she had been working in domestic service since she was 14 years old, and that she did not, as far as he could tell, feel sorry for herself about any of it. She talked about her life, the way someone talks about a road they'd walked, not with pride, not with complaint, but with the matter-of-fact clarity of someone who has been paying attention to where the rocks were. When the bread was done, she went in to get it, and he stood up from the step and knocked the snow off his hat. "Same time Friday," she said, from inside the kitchen. Not a question. He looked at the empty doorway. "Are you asking or telling?" "I'm asking," she said. "There's a difference. I'd like you to know that I know there's a difference." He understood what she meant. She was telling him she was not confused about what this was or wasn't. She was choosing to let him come back, and she wanted him to understand that it was a choice, not a default, not a capitulation to his position or his family name. It was her decision, offered from the interior of a kitchen in which she was the one with the bread. "Friday," he said. He walked home through the snow, and by the time he reached the ranch gate, he was cold enough that he should have been thinking about the fire and dry boots and something hot to eat. He was mostly thinking about Friday. Silas noticed before anything was worth noticing, because Silas had always been that way. He'd built a cattle empire by seeing things before they were obvious. And he applied the same faculty to his son with a precision that Caleb had found useful, occasionally, and irritating often. It was a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after the dance, when his father sat down across from him at the dinner table and put both forearms flat on the wood and said, "I'm not going to tell you what to do." Caleb looked up from his food. "That's new. I'm going to tell you what I see." "That's less new." Silas ignored this. "I see a man who's been riding into town on a schedule that has nothing to do with the ranch. I see a man who's been spending time at the Garner boarding house in the early morning when he has a cook and a kitchen right here. And I see that same man sitting across from me right now, looking at his food like it said something unkind to him. Caleb set his fork down. Her name is Eliza Merrick. I know her name, and you have an opinion about it. Silas was quiet for a moment, turning his water glass in his hands. It was the gesture Caleb associated with his father, saying something he'd thought about carefully. The opinion I have, Silas said, is not the one you think I have. Caleb waited. What I think his father said is that this territory is not kind to women who step above the place they were assigned. Not because those women don't deserve better, because the people who assigned them that place will not let them forget it. And if you go and stand in the middle of this town and declare that a boarding house girl is, he stopped. Chose different words. If you do what I think you're considering doing, then everything that this town wants to throw at her will have your name attached to it. And that is a weight, son. That is a real and lasting weight, and she is the one who will be carrying it. It was, Caleb thought, a more careful argument than he'd expected from his father, and more honest. I know that, he said. Do you know that she knows that? He thought about it, about the way she'd told him he was probably still someone to be careful of, and meant it without cruelty. About the way she'd drawn the line at the kitchen door, not because of propriety exactly, but because she'd spent her entire adult life understanding that her position left her no room for error, and she wasn't about to forget that because a man brought her coffee one morning. She knows more than I do, he said. Silas looked at him for a long moment. Then be honest with her, he said finally, about all of it, about what this place will say and do. Let her decide. It was the most important piece of advice his father had ever given him, and he knew it the moment he heard it, and he carried it. He was honest with her on a Friday in late January, which was not the same Friday they'd agreed on, because that Friday she'd been down with a head cold and misses. Garner had shooed him off the step in a manner that suggested the nursing of sick employees was a solemn responsibility that did not involve cowboys sitting around in the cold. He'd left a jar of his cook's honey, good, thick, late summer honey from the Southfield hives on the step, and gone home. And Eliza had not mentioned it the following Friday, and he hadn't brought it up. This particular Friday, in the last grip of January cold, she was well, and the coffee was strong, and they'd progressed from the back step to the small table inside the kitchen, because Mrs. Garner had developed a pragmatic attitude toward whatever this was, and had decided that if it was happening, it was going to happen inside where the participants were less likely to develop frostbite. Caleb told her what his father had said. Not all of it, not the parts that were his father's private thinking, but the substance of it. That the territory would talk. That women in her position who stepped above what people had decided was their station became targets. That the Thorne name was a shield for him and would be for her a different kind of attention altogether. She listened without interrupting, which he'd learned was her way. Her hands were around her cup. Her eyes were on the table. When he finished, she said, "You thought I didn't know that. I thought you deserved to hear me say it." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind was doing its winter work on the town, moving down the main street with cold indifference and rattling every loose thing it found. When I was 17, she said, not looking up, I worked in a house in Bristol for a family that had a son. He was 19. He was not unkind, exactly. He was just he decided he liked me. And in that household, in that situation, his liking me was not something I had any mechanism to decline. She stopped, picked up her cup, put it down. When his mother found out he'd been paying me attention, she dismissed me without a letter of character, which meant I couldn't get another position for 8 months. 8 months. She said the number like it was a distance she'd walked barefoot. He didn't say anything. This was not a moment for saying things. I'm not telling you that story because I think you're like him, she said. I'm telling you because I need you to understand that I don't come to this, whatever this is, without history. And the history makes me slow. It makes me suspicious of good intentions. It makes me difficult, probably. It makes you careful, he said. There's a difference. She finally looked at him. Her eyes were direct, and there was something in them that was not softness. She was not a soft woman and probably would never be, and that was a fact rather than a flaw. But there was something that was less guarded than he'd seen before. "I like that you came back," she said, "even with the invented reasons. I knew they were invented, and I liked that you kept coming anyway. That's all I'm going to say about that." He nodded. "That's enough. It's not a promise of anything." "I know. And if this, whatever this is, becomes something that the town notices, I need you to understand that I will not be humiliated quietly." Not again. "If you're going to stand in my corner, you have to actually stand there." The way she said it was not a threat and not a test. It was a condition, the plain statement of a woman who had learned to define her own terms because no one else was going to do it for her. "I know which corner I'm in," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she picked up her cup and drank and looked out the window at the January street. "The bread today is sourdough," she said. "I made extra. You can take a loaf for the ranch if you want it." He understood that she was not changing the subject. She was continuing it, in the way she continued most things, by returning to the practical, the immediate, the real. He could have the bread. He could take it home. Life would proceed. They would see what happened. "Thank you," he said. She went to get it, and he sat at the kitchen table in Mrs. Garner's boarding house and listened to the wind outside and the sounds of bread being wrapped in cloth, and he felt, in some part of himself that rarely got consulted, quietly and completely certain. February brought a cold that was serious even by frontier standards, and the cattle drive season, still 3 months out, meant the town contracted inward the way towns do in hard winters, fewer reasons to be outside. More time spent in close proximity to the same people, which had the natural effect of producing more opinions about other people's business. The opinions started small. It was Marta Jennings who first said something at the dry goods store, loud enough for 3 women to hear, about how it was peculiar that Caleb Thorne had taken to spending his Friday mornings at the boarding house when there were plenty of perfectly suitable women in the territory who would have welcomed his company in a warmer and more appropriate setting. The 3 women who heard it agreed in the way women agree when they're less certain than they sound. Within a week, the observation had traveled through enough mouths to become a fact of public knowledge, and facts of public knowledge in small frontier settlements have a way of hardening into stone. Eliza heard about it from Mrs. Garner, who told her with the directness of a woman who believed that information was more useful than protection. "What do you want to do?" Mrs. Garner asked. Eliza finished folding the laundry she was folding. She was quiet long enough that Mrs. Garner might have thought she hadn't heard, but Mrs. Garner knew better. "Nothing," Eliza said. "I'm not going to do anything about people's opinions." Mrs. Garner nodded slowly. "And him? He knows," she said. "He'll handle himself." She said it with a certainty that she recognized, even as she said it, was new. 3 months ago, she would not have trusted a man she'd known for a handful of Friday mornings to handle himself in any way that wouldn't eventually require her to pay for it. Now she did, and the difference between then and now was not that he'd proven himself through grand actions. He'd proven himself through the quality of his attention. By listening when she talked, by not pushing when she drew a line, by bringing honey to a sick woman's doorstep and not asking credit for it. Small things, consistent things. In her experience, small, consistent things were harder to fake than grand gestures. He came on Friday as usual, and she told him directly what was being said because she'd promised herself she would not conduct whatever this was in a fog of withheld information. He nodded. He looked at the table for a moment. "Do you want me to stop coming?" he asked. "No," she said. "Then I won't. They'll say worse things, I know." Caleb. She used his name deliberately. It was the 3rd or 4th time she'd used it, and she still deployed it with intention rather than habit. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to think before you answer." He looked up. "What is it that you actually want?" "Not eventually." "Right now. What are you doing here every Friday?" He thought about it. She waited. That was the thing about asking him real questions. He took them seriously, turned them over, didn't reach for the easy answer. I want to know you, he said finally, the specific person you are. Not a version of you that's useful to me or comfortable to me. Just you. I want to know what you think about things. I want to know why you make sourdough on Fridays and plain bread on Tuesdays. I want to know where you were trying to get to when you left Bristol. I want to know all of it, and I'm in no hurry, and I don't have a plan beyond coming back next Friday. She looked at him for a long moment. I make sourdough on Fridays because the starter needs 4 days, she said. I begin at Monday, he smiled. It was a real smile, not practiced, slightly lopsided on the left side. She'd noticed that about his smile it was never perfectly symmetrical, which made it look more like a real thing than like a performance of a thing. Good, he said. I'll come Mondays too then. You absolutely will not, she said. But the flatness in it had something new running underneath it, something that was not quite warmth and not quite amusement, but was related to both. He came back the following Monday anyway. She had the starter going, and the kitchen smelled like something alive and working, and she didn't tell him to leave. Spring arrived the way springs do after hard winters grudgingly, in fits with setbacks. A late snow in March that killed 3 of the Thorne Ranch's new calves. A flooding problem at the south end of town that kept the main road impassable for nearly 2 weeks. A dispute between 2 of the territory's ranching families that had nothing to do with Ironwood Crossing, but created a tension that drifted through town like smoke, putting people on edge. Through all of it, the Friday mornings continued, and the Monday mornings. And occasionally, when he had legitimate business in town midweek, a cup coffee at the kitchen table that stretched longer than either of them strictly acknowledged it would. They began to know each other the way people do when they spend time in the same room working on ordinary things, not through dramatic revelations, but through the accumulation of small, unremarkable observations. He knew she was left-handed and didn't like sweet coffee and had an opinion about every piece of bread she made, a running critical assessment of her own work that she announced to no one in particular and that he found himself looking forward to. She knew he was impatient with his own mistakes in a way he was never impatient with anyone else's, that he had a habit of tapping the side of his cup when he was thinking about something he hadn't decided yet, and that he'd grown up in the ranch kitchen more than in the main house, which explained something about why he was so comfortable in hers. There was a Wednesday in April, well into what had developed into something that neither of them had yet named, when she was working through a particularly difficult batch of pastry dough that kept going wrong too warm. The butter kept breaking, and she'd started over twice, and was midway through a 3rd attempt and was not saying anything, but was saying quite a lot with her silence and the set of her jaw. He was at the table with his coffee and a fence line map he'd been supposedly studying for 20 minutes. It's the butter, he said, without looking up from the map. I know it's the butter. My father's cook says you need to work it cold. Like the kitchen needs to be cold. Your father's cook doesn't have a kitchen that faces south with a window that doesn't close all the way. He looked up. She was right. The south-facing window was a problem he'd noticed before. I can fix that window. She looked at him. I mean it, he said. I can fix it this afternoon. It's a latch issue. Stared at the broken pastry for a moment. That window has been wrong for 2 years. Mrs. Garner doesn't fix windows. Mrs. Garner fixes what she can afford to fix. He got up from the table, went to the window, looked at the latch, went out to his horse, came back with a small toolkit that he apparently carried as a matter of course, and fixed the window in about 25 minutes while she worked the now cooler pastry, and it began to behave. You carry tools with you, she said. It wasn't a question. Things break, he said. It's useful, she thought about that. She watched him work, the competent and showy way he did it, the same way he did everything not performing it, just doing it. And she felt something that she'd been feeling more and more and was less and less inclined to argue with. The pastry came out right. The window closed properly for the first time in 2 years. He drank his coffee and looked at the fence map, and she wrapped the pastry, and neither of them said anything for a while, But the silence was the kind that doesn't need filling, and both of them knew it, and that knowing was its own kind of truth. It was Mrs. Garner who said, the following morning, when Eliza was alone in the kitchen starting the sourdough, "You know the whole town's watching." Eliza measured her flour. "I know," and she thought about the latch on the window. About small, consistent things being harder to fake than grand gestures. About a man who carried tools with him because things break and it's useful. "And I'm not afraid of the whole town," she said, which was not entirely true. She was afraid. She'd been afraid of things like this for the better part of her adult life, and one fixed window latch and a handful of good mornings had not erased that. But she was less afraid than she'd been, and she was, for the first time in years, more interested in what might be possible than in what had already gone wrong. That, she thought, was not nothing. That, as it turned out, was the thing that kept her standing when Founders' Day arrived and brought with it everything the town had been saving up to say. Founders' Day came on a Thursday. The town had been building toward it for 3 weeks, the way frontier settlements build toward any occasion that gives people an excuse to stop working and start performing performance being, in Ironwood Crossing. The art of being seen doing the right things by the right people in the right order. The men on the planning committee had repainted the freight office front and strung new rope between the posts for the lanterns. The women's auxiliary had organized the food tables with a precision that suggested the arrangement of pies was a matter of civic importance. Children had been assigned to carry things and told not to run, which they ignored with the cheerful consistency of children everywhere. Eliza had been helping with the preparations since Monday. This was not unusual, Mrs. Garner's boarding house provided food service for the Founders' Day celebration every year. 3 large tables of breads, savory pies, cured meats, and baked goods that fed most of the settlement through the afternoon and into the evening. It was the boarding house's largest annual contract, and it meant that Eliza had spent 4 days doing the work of 8 people with the focused, slightly frantic energy of someone who understood that the quality of the output reflected directly on the only livelihood she had. She hadn't seen Caleb since the previous Friday. He'd told her he'd have ranch business, keeping him close to home for most of the week, something to do with a water line that had collapsed on the south end of the property and needed to be dug out before it caused more damage. She'd nodded and gone back to her bread, and if the week had felt differently shaped without his Monday morning appearance at the kitchen table, she'd kept that observation to herself. She was not a woman who said everything she noticed. She'd learned young that observing carefully and speaking selectively were 2 of the most useful skills available to a person who started with nothing else. The morning of Founders' Day she rose before 5, which was earlier than her usual before 5, and began the final preparations in a kitchen that smelled, by 7 o'clock, like something extraordinary. The layered, warm complexity of bread and pastry and slow-cooked savory things that Mrs. Garner said was the best advertisement the boarding house ever put out. By 10 in the morning, the food tables at the celebration ground were arranged, and Eliza had changed into her only respectable dress, the gray one, the same one she'd worn to the cattle season dance, and was making her 3rd trip back from the boarding house, carrying a covered tray of the small hand pies that always went first. She was crossing the main street when she heard her name. Not shouted. Said, the way you say something when you want the people around you to hear it without appearing to be announcing it. Eliza Merrick, Dorothy Hatch, wife of the feed store owner, speaking to another woman whose name Eliza had never learned. The boarding house girl, you know she's been receiving Caleb Thorne every Friday for 6 months. The other woman made a sound that managed to convey both fascination and disapproval simultaneously. Every Friday, Dorothy repeated for emphasis, and Mondays. And any other day he finds an excuse, from what I hear. In the kitchen, mind you, not even in a proper room. Eliza kept walking. She'd learned to keep walking years before she ever arrived in Ironwood Crossing. The hand pies needed to reach the table before they cooled. Poor man's being taken advantage of, Dorothy said. A girl in that position, she knows what she's doing. They always do. Eliza reached the food table, set the tray down, and began arranging the pies with the same efficiency she brought to everything. Her hands were steady. She was aware that the two women were still close enough to be heard, and that several people in the immediate area had heard and were now applying the studied indifference of frontier folk who are paying very close attention while appearing to pay none. She had been in this exact position before, multiple times. Different towns, different names. Same essential situation, a woman without family or money or position, which meant a woman without the armor that made other women untouchable, which meant a target that anyone could hit without consequence. She knew what she was supposed to do: lower her eyes. Absorb it quietly, wait for it to pass. That was the established method, learned through long practice, and it had served her well enough to keep her employed and housed and moving forward when moving forward was the only option. She arranged the last hand pie on the tray. She straightened the cloth underneath. She picked up her empty tray and turned to go back for the next load. Margaret Whitfield was standing 4 feet away. Not the same position as the cattle season dance, not blocking her path this time, not openly. Margaret was standing with 2 other women in a loose group near the adjacent table, and her positioning near Eliza was technically coincidental in the way that things are technically coincidental when someone has arranged them deliberately. "Lovely pies," Margaret said, to the women she was with, not to Eliza. "The boarding house does good work. It's what they're there for, isn't it? Providing a service." The 2 women with her smiled with the careful, calibrated warmth of people who'd learned to follow Margaret's conversational lead without overtly committing to whatever she was doing. "Some people," Margaret continued, still not looking at Eliza, still addressing her companions with the pleasant, reflective tone of someone thinking aloud, "don't quite understand that providing a service is not the same as being a guest. It's a confusion that causes all sorts of problems." Eliza stopped walking. She hadn't planned to stop. Her feet stopped of their own independent decision, planted themselves on the packed dirt of the celebration ground, and stayed. Margaret turned, as if only then noticing she was there. "Oh, Eliza, are there more pies coming? I imagine you've got quite a bit left to bring out." What happened next was something Eliza would not be able to fully account for later. Not anger, exactly. Not courage, exactly. Because courage implies doing something in spite of fear, and what she felt in that moment was closer to a door swinging open than to fear being overcome. Like something that had been holding for a very long time simply let go. She looked at Margaret Whitfield directly and said, in a voice that was completely level, "There are more pies. I'll have them out in 20 minutes. Is there anything else you need from me, Mrs. Whitfield?" The question was polite, completely and precisely polite. It offered nothing to grab hold of, no anger, no hurt, no acknowledgement that the previous 30 seconds had been anything other than a straightforward exchange about catering. But the directness of it, the refusal to look away, the absence of the usual slight bow that Eliza had always performed for women like Margaret, the flatness of "anything else you need from me" landed differently than Margaret had expected. Margaret blinked. "No," she said. "That's all." "Good," said Eliza, and walked back toward the boarding house. Her hands were shaking slightly by the time she reached the kitchen. She stood over the remaining trays for a moment and breathed slowly. Her heart was beating too fast, and her jaw ached from holding it steady, and she was aware, with the careful honesty she tried to apply to herself, that what she had done out there was a very small thing that had cost her a disproportionate amount. That was fine. Small things cost what they cost. She picked up the next tray and went back out. Caleb arrived at the celebration ground at 11:30. He'd ridden in from the south end of the property, the long way, because the waterline work had gone further into the morning than expected, and he was dusty and had changed in the bunkhouse on the way through, rather than going back to the main house. He looked. His foreman had told him with some amusement, like a man who'd gotten dressed in a hurry, which was accurate. He spotted Eliza before he spotted his father, which was also accurate. She was at the food table, finishing the arrangement of the last delivery, and she moved with the same efficient directness she always moved with, but something was different. He noticed it immediately. The way you notice when a sound you've gotten used to changes pitch. She was more contained than usual. The stillness that was normally a natural quality of her had tightened into something deliberate, like a hand around a thing it's being careful not to drop. He crossed toward her, nodding at the people who said his name along the way, moving through the greetings with the minimum courteous time that 28 years of Ironwood Crossing's social navigation had taught him. "You look like something happened," he said quietly, reaching the food table. "Good morning," she said, "your dusty waterline." "What happened?" She looked at him sideways. Margaret Whitfield decided to make a point in front of an audience. He felt his jaw tighten. "What did she say?" Eliza told him. Briefly and without drama, the way she reported most things that had happened to her as facts, not grievances, because she'd found grievances cost more energy to carry than they were worth. She told him about Dorothy Hatch on the main street and about Margaret's performance near the food table, and she told him what she'd said in response, and she looked at the table the whole time she talked rather than at him, which was the thing she did when she was telling him something she hadn't decided how to feel about yet. He was quiet when she finished. "Are you all right?" he asked. She thought about it, which was what she always did with questions she could have answered quickly. "I'm intact," she said, which is not the same thing as all right, but it's what I've got right now. That was the most honest answer she'd given him about her own state in 6 months, and he recognized it as such. He reached out and put his hand briefly over hers on the edge of the table. Not a grab, not a hold, just the specific weight of a hand resting over another hand for the 3 or 4 seconds it took her to register it and not pull away. "I said I'd stand in your corner," he said. "I'm telling you now, in case it matters." She looked up at him. "It matters," she said. "I just need today to not be something I can't recover from if it goes wrong." "It's not going to go wrong. You don't know that." "No," he agreed. "I don't." He took his hand back. "But I know which direction I'm walking." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she straightened and smoothed her apron and became visibly the woman who still had work to do. "There are still 2 trays in the kitchen. Mrs. Garner needs help carrying them out." "I'll get them," he said. She blinked. "You'll, Mrs. Garner knows me. I'll get the trays." He walked to the boarding house, retrieved the 2 remaining trays from a Mrs. Garner, who handed them over with an expression of quiet and unspoken approval, and carried them back across the main street to the food tables in full view of the entire settlement, which had definitely noticed and which would definitely be talking about this for the remainder of the afternoon. He was aware of that. He'd made the calculation deliberately. There were things you could do on the public record and things you could not, and carrying trays of hand pies was so ordinary that it couldn't be argued with a man helping with a task. Nothing more, but in Ironwood Crossing's particular social arithmetic, it said exactly what he wanted it to say. "I know where I'm standing." When he set the trays down, Eliza looked at him for a moment without speaking. "Thank you," she said finally. "Anytime." She turned back to the arrangement and he went to find his father. Silas was in his usual place, not the same physical location as at the cattle season dance, but the equivalent of it, the spot where the ground was most solid and the view was best, and a man could observe without appearing to study. He was talking to Hiram Cole, who ran the dry goods store, and who had the useful frontier quality of saying exactly what he thought without apparent concern for what anyone thought of it. When Caleb arrived, Hiram finished whatever he was saying, nodded, and moved off with the economy of a man who knows when a father and son need to talk. "You brought the trays in," Silas said. The water line ran long. "I was late. That's not why you brought the trays." Caleb looked at the crowd, at the food tables, at the people beginning to drift through the afternoon with plates and conversation and the careful social navigation of a community that knew everyone's business and chose its moments to demonstrate it. "Margaret Whitfield got at her this morning," he said. Silas was quiet for a moment. I heard something. Then you know? I know what I heard. I know what I see right now. His father turned his water glass in his hands. I see a young woman who did not flinch and did not make a scene and held herself straight all morning. And I see my son who arrived looking like he'd ridden through a creek bed and went straight to carry someone else's trays. Caleb didn't say anything. I also, Silas continued, Douglas Whitfield over there by the freight office, who has been watching you since you arrived, and his wife next to him who is speaking into his ear with the expression of a woman who is building a case. Caleb looked. Douglas Whitfield was a large man, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had probably been handsome 20 years ago and had since settled into something harder and less readable. He was indeed watching. When his eyes met Caleb's, he didn't look away, which was its own kind of statement. He's going to say something today, Caleb said. Not a question. Almost certainly, Silas said. The question is when and where and what you're going to do about it. He can say what he wants. Can he say it to her face or only to other people? Caleb looked at his father. Because there's a difference, Silas said, between a man saying things about someone in private and a man deciding to make an example of something in public. And today is very much a public occasion. He was right, and Caleb knew it. And the knowledge sat heavy because he could not control what Douglas Whitfield decided to do, and he could not stand next to Eliza every second of the afternoon, and he did not want her to need him. Standing next to her, he wanted her to be able to stand on her own ground, which she was more than capable of. But standing on your own ground was one thing, and being publicly cut was another, and the difference was that the second one left marks. He found her again at the edges of the afternoon, when the food was mostly gone and the tables were being cleared. She was working, predictably, because she was always working, but she looked more settled than the morning. Less like something being carefully held together. He walked beside her as she carried empty trays back toward the boarding house, and they talked about nothing consequential: the weather, the crowd size, the fact that the hand pies had gone first again, which she noted with the same critical satisfaction she brought to all her baking assessments. The pastry was better this batch, she said. The window helped. I've been able to keep it cooler. The latch is holding? It's holding. She paused. You did that right. I usually do things right, he said. It's the planning where I sometimes go wrong. She gave him a sideways look that was half skepticism and half something warmer, and he was in the middle of noticing it when he heard Douglas Whitfield's voice, about 15 feet behind them. Thorne. He turned. Douglas was approaching with the measured pace of a man who'd thought about this, who decided this was the moment. Margaret was not with him. He'd come alone, which was either better or worse. Caleb hadn't decided. Douglas, he said. Douglas looked at Eliza first. Not a friendly look. The look of a man taking stock of something he's decided is beneath his attention but is giving attention to anyway, which was its own specific kind of contempt. Then he looked back at Caleb. Need a word. Go ahead. Douglas paused. He'd clearly expected to draw Caleb away from Eliza. He'd expected the usual male shorthand step aside. Just between us and Caleb had just made it clear that wasn't happening. Fine, Douglas said. I'll say it here. He pulled himself straighter. What you're doing, the way you've been conducting yourself, the company you've been keeping in public, it's becoming a distraction. People are talking. People talk about everything, Caleb said. What's your point, Douglas? My point is that there are expectations. Your family built this town. My father built this town. And there are certain standards that come with that. Standards of conduct, of association. Your father understands this. Leave my father out of it. Douglas's jaw tightened. He was not accustomed to being interrupted, and twice in 30 seconds was clearly operating beyond his tolerance. What I'm saying is that the woman you've been associating yourself with publicly, her name, Caleb said, is Eliza Merrick. The silence that followed was about 4 seconds long. In those 4 seconds, the 3 people within easy earshot, a couple Caleb half recognized, and an older man who'd been nearby checking the rope on the lantern posts, All went very still and very quiet in the way of people who understand they are. Witnessing something that has stopped being small talk. Douglas looked at Eliza again. This time she held his gaze, straight and quiet. With that quality she'd had since the morning, the refusal to shrink, the deliberate stillness that was not submission. Eliza Merrick, Douglas said, tasting the name with the kind of courtesy that is the outer shell of contempt. The boarding house girl, a resident of this town, Caleb said. A working woman, and someone I hold in high regard, which is not your business and not your decision. Becomes everyone's business when you conduct it on a public occasion. Everything in this town happens on a public occasion. That's the nature of a small settlement, Douglas. Everyone can see everyone. He took a slow breath. He was not angry, exactly, but it was a cold anger, the kind that sharpens rather than scatters. I hear what you're saying. I understand the position you're representing. And I'm telling you directly, man to man, that I have considered it, and it's not going to change anything. Douglas looked at him for a long moment. Your father has given me his counsel privately. I don't need you to repeat it. Beat, too. You're making a mistake, Douglas said. Maybe, Caleb said. It'll be mine to live with. Douglas turned and walked back toward the freight office without another word, the precise walk of a man who has made his statement and is choosing to regard the outcome as something other than a defeat. Caleb turned to Eliza. She was looking at the space where Douglas had been. Her face was composed completely, but her right hand, he noticed, was gripping the edge of the empty tray she was holding with white-knuckled force. Are you all right? He asked. I'm intact, she said, the same word as the morning. But her voice was different. Now there was something underneath it that was less controlled. She looked at him. You didn't have to do that. I know. He's the second largest ranch in the territory. His wife already. I know who he is, Caleb said. People will line up behind him. This doesn't end today. I know that too. She stared at him, searching his face for the thing that she'd been trained by long experience to look for the crack, the moment when the cost of something became clear enough that a person backed away from it. She looked for a long time. She didn't find it. I have to return these trays, she said. I know. I'll walk with you. She almost said, you don't have to. He could see her about to say it. She stopped herself, and whatever she decided in the space of that stopped sentence was something he didn't ask about, then or later. They walked back to the boarding house together, crossing the main street in the late afternoon light, in full view of whoever was watching, and he carried the tray without being asked, and she didn't argue about it. That evening, the celebration shifted into its musical phase fiddle players tuning, couples organizing themselves in the open yard, the particular festive transformation of a working day settlement into something that was, briefly, lighter. Eliza was still working the fringes of it, managing the final clearing of the food tables. She had changed back into her working apron over the gray dress because the evening service required it. The moment she'd been bracing for all day arrived an hour after dark. She was moving between the cleared tables and the boarding house kitchen, carrying the last of the stacked dishes, when she came within earshot of a group of women near the east side of the yard, not Margaret this time, not the established voices of social authority, but younger women in their late 20s or early 30s, who had perhaps been emboldened by the day's events or by the conversation that had clearly been running through the celebration since mid-morning. She's not bad-looking if you don't mind the roughness, one of them said. Not quietly enough, but what would they even talk about? She's a servant. She bakes bread. What's she got to say to a man like Caleb Thorne at the end of the day? Eliza stopped walking. She stopped not because she was going to say something. She stopped because the question had landed somewhere. It wasn't supposed to land somewhere beneath the surface she'd been holding all day, past the carefully maintained composure, and it found the particular crack that had always been there. The one that whispered, "What are you, really? What do you actually have to offer?" She stood there for 2 seconds that felt much longer, holding a stack of dishes, and then she made herself move again. Into the kitchen, set the dishes down, stood over the sink, and looked at the window, the one with the fixed latch, the one that now closed properly, and breathed. What do you have to offer? She'd asked herself that question in other forms, in other cities, on other difficult days. And the answer had always been the same inadequate inventory: labor, discipline, the ability to produce good bread under difficult conditions, a capacity for honest observation, and a stubborn unwillingness to disappear, even when disappearing would have been easier. Not glamorous, not the kind of things that impressed rooms full of people. But they were hers, earned with her own hands, in her own time, without anyone giving them to her. She dried her hands on the kitchen cloth and went back out. The fiddle had started in earnest now, a lively reel that had people clapping, and the children who should have been in wagon beds, definitely not in wagon beds. Lanterns swung with the evening wind. The smell of the night was grass and cold and wood smoke. She was sorting the last of the borrowed dishcloths near the east table when she became aware that the mood of the yard had shifted slightly, the particular stillness that moves through a crowd when something is happening. That people want to watch without appearing to watch. She looked up. Caleb was crossing the yard. He was not heading toward the Whitfield family. Not toward the freight office or the group of ranching men who'd been standing together near the north fence. He was walking with the deliberate, unhurried purpose of a man who has thought about exactly where he's going and has resolved any doubts he might have had about it. He was walking toward her. The yard had not gone silent. The fiddle was still going. People were still talking. But there was that particular quality of collective held breath that happens when something is about to be made public that everyone already knows in private. He reached her, stopped. He'd changed since the afternoon, the trail dust gone, jacket brushed, the kind of reasonable tidy-up that said he'd made some effort without pretending the heck was more formal than it was. He looked at her in the way he looked at her, sometimes direct and unperformed, like there was nothing between his attention and the thing it was resting on. He held out his hand. She looked at it. "First dance," he said. It wasn't a command. It wasn't the casual ease of a man accustomed to being said yes to. It was offered the way he offered most things he meant plainly, with the full acknowledgement that it might be declined. "This is the whole town watching," she said quietly. "I know. If I take your hand out there, that's not a private thing anymore." "That can't be taken back." "I know that too," she looked at him. She looked at the yard, at the people who were very carefully not staring in their direction. At the lanterns swaying overhead, at the fiddle player who was moving into a slower tune, something that asked for partners. She thought about Dorothy Hatch's voice on the main street that morning. About Douglas Whitfield's deliberate contempt, about the women near the east table and their particular casual cruelty. About 17 years of being careful, of taking up as little space as possible, of absorbing things quietly and moving on. She thought about a window latch that finally closed properly. About honey on a doorstep on a sick morning, about a man who had looked at her, really looked at her, and asked what she thought about things. "Only if you choose it," he said, and the way he said it told her that he meant it, that his hand would go back down if hers did not meet it, that there was no expectation buried inside the offer, that this was hers to decide. She looked at his hand one more moment, then she placed hers in it. They walked onto the dance floor together, into the lamplight, into the full and undeniable view of everyone in Ironwood Crossing, who had an opinion about what they were seeing and had been waiting all day to express it. Eliza kept her chin level. She did not look at the crowd. She looked at the man in front of her, who was looking back at her with the same undivided attention he'd been giving her since a December morning on a kitchen step, and she thought, this is what it feels like. Not to be rescued, not to be chosen in spite of something. Just chosen. The fiddle played, they danced. And Silas Thorne, standing at the edge of the yard near the freight office, watched his son dance with a boarding house girl in a gray dress, watched the town rearrange itself around the fact of it, watched the thing he'd built over 30 years of hard work suddenly feel, for the first time, like it might outlast him in the way that actually mattered. He didn't move from his spot near the wall. He didn't need to. For a long moment, he raised his cup slightly, not a toast exactly, not a performance, just the small private gesture of a man acknowledging something to himself that he hadn't expected to feel. His son had already made his choice. And Silas, who had spent his life betting on people he believed in, found himself thinking that for all the ways this could still be difficult, and it would be, he had no illusions about that he had not seen his son look more certain about anything in 28 years. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the whole point. The dance ended around 10 o'clock, when the fiddle player's arm gave out and the wind picked up enough to start pulling at the lanterns in a way that suggested the evening was done, whether the people in it were ready or not. Eliza helped with the final clearing. She always did. It was the kind of thing that had been so thoroughly wired into her over 17 years of domestic work that stopping at the end of a public event while there were still things to be picked up felt physically uncomfortable, like leaving a sentence unfinished. Caleb watched her from a distance for a few minutes, talking to two of his ranch hands who'd come into town for the celebration, and then he crossed to her and said quietly that he'd see her Friday, and she nodded, and he left. It was, from the outside, an unremarkable exchange. From the inside, it was the most ordinary thing that had ever happened to her, and the ordinariness of it, the simple, unceremonious normalcy of a man saying, "I'll see you Friday," the way people say it when Friday is a given, was the thing she was still thinking about when she finally locked the boarding house kitchen at midnight and went upstairs to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a while without lighting the lamp. The town would talk. It already was talking. She'd heard 3 conversations in the last 2 hours that stopped or shifted when she walked nearby, which was a form of being zgasast that she'd grown up inside of and knew how to read. Tomorrow would be worse, probably. The day after that, she genuinely didn't know. What she knew was this. When Caleb had held out his hand in the lantern-lit yard, she'd had about 4 seconds to make the most consequential decision of her adult life. And she'd made it with the same faculty she made bread, by reading what was in front of her and trusting what her hands already knew. She'd spent 17 years learning to assess people accurately. It was survival, not sentiment. And what her assessment of Caleb Thorne had produced, over 6 months of Friday mornings and kitchen conversations, and a fixed window latch and honey on a sick doorstep, was a single stubborn conclusion. He was what he appeared to be. Not perfect, not easy, not without his father's stubbornness and his own particular impatience with himself, but real. Consistent in the way that mattered. She lit the lamp finally, got undressed, and lay down on the narrow boarding house bed that had been her only bed for 3 years. The ceiling was the same ceiling it always was. The sounds of Ironwood Crossing settling into night were the same sounds. But something in the room felt different, in the way rooms feel different after something has been decided. She was not naive enough to think the dance had resolved anything. In fact, she suspected it had started something that would be considerably harder than anything that had come before it. She was right. Silas Thorne came to the boarding house on a Tuesday. Eliza was alone in the kitchen. Mrs. Garner had gone to the mill, the same reliable absence that had structured many of the more significant moments of the past 6 months, which Eliza had begun to suspect was not entirely coincidental. She heard the knock at the front door and dried her hands and went to open it, and found Caleb's father standing on the step with his hat in his hands and the specific expression of a man who has rehearsed what he's going to say and is now uncertain whether it was the right thing to rehearse. She had met Silas Thorne briefly, twice before, once at the cattle season dance, where she'd been working and he'd been watching, and once in passing on the main street when Caleb had stopped to speak with her while his father was 3 steps behind. Both times, Silas had been polite and contained and had looked at her with that assessing quality that was clearly a family trait, the careful attention of people who'd learned to judge things accurately because inaccuracy cost them. "Mr. Thorne," she said. "Miss Merrick." He held his hat. "I'd like to speak with you, if you're willing." She stepped back from the door. "Come in." She put coffee on because she always put coffee on, and he sat at the kitchen table, the same table where his son had been sitting every Friday for 6 months, and placed his hat on the wood beside him and looked at the kitchen with the quiet, observational manner of a man who was reading a room. She sat across from him and waited. She'd found over the years that waiting was almost always more useful than filling silence. "I'm not here to discourage you," he said finally. "I want to be clear about that first, all right? I know you probably expected the opposite." "I didn't know what to expect," she said honestly. He looked at his hands on the table, the hands of a man who'd built something from nothing, scarred in the specific way of a person who'd worked with wire and wood and cattle for 30 years. "I spent some time after the dance thinking about what my objections were. Whether they were about the two of you, or whether they were about what other people would think about the two of you. And I found that most of what I'd called concern was actually the second thing." She was quiet, letting this land where it needed to land. "That's not a good reason," he said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." He looked at her then, directly, and she held it the way she'd held Douglas Whitfield's look at the celebration, steady and without pretense. "I want to understand something," he said, "and I'm going to ask it plainly, because I don't have another way of asking things. Did you pursue my son, or did he pursue you?" It was not a hostile question. It was the question of a man who needed accurate information and was asking for it directly rather than building up to it, which she respected. "He came to the kitchen," she said, repeatedly, "with reasons that we both knew weren't the real reason." She paused. "I let him come back. That was a choice I made, but the direction was his." Silas nodded slowly. "Can I ask you something in return?" she said. He looked slightly surprised, not offended surprised. "Go ahead. What is it you're actually worried about?" For him, not for the family name. For him specifically. He was quiet for a moment. The coffee had finished on the stove, and she got up and poured 2 cups and set one in front of him and sat back down. And he turned the cup in his hands the way Caleb turned cups when he was thinking, and she noticed the gesture with a small, quiet ache. "He's stubborn," Silas said. "He's got my stubbornness, which is considerable. And when he decides something, he goes all the way with it. That's useful on a ranch. It's not always useful in the other parts of life." He looked at her. "What I worry about is him going all the way into something without the other person being as certain as he is. Because when Caleb Thorne commits to something and it fails, he doesn't recover easy." She sat with that for a moment. "I'm not certain," she said. "I want to be honest about that. I'm not an uncertain person by nature. I've had to make a lot of decisions fast with bad information, and I've learned to make them and live with them. But this—" She stopped, started again. "The last person who said he wanted to help me cost me 8 months of work and my ability to trust that kind of offer for the better part of a decade. So I'm not certain. I'm careful. Those are not the same thing, and I know they're not the same thing." Silas looked at her steadily. "But I am," she said, and her voice was level, "more willing to be wrong about this than I have ever been willing to be wrong about anything." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the street noise of a Tuesday morning went on without them horses and cartwheels and someone calling to someone else across the road. "That's an honest answer," Silas said. "It's the only kind I have." He drank his coffee. She drank hers. He looked around the kitchen again at the bread on the cooling rack, at the orderly arrangement of the prep table, at the window with its new latch that she'd never told him about. "My wife died when Caleb was 11, he said, not as a non sequitur, but in the way people introduce things that explain other things. Fever fast. 3 days, he looked at the table. "I ran the ranch, and I ran the house, and I raised the boy, and I did all 3 badly in different ways. The house especially. He paused. The house was never really a home after that. It was a place where we slept and kept our things. Caleb grew up eating most of his meals in the kitchen because the cook was kinder than I knew how to be at the time." She didn't say anything. This was not a moment for saying things. "I built things," he said. "It's what I know how to do. I built the cattle operation, and I built the water agreement, and I helped build half the structures in this town. and I thought providing that was sufficient. He looked at her. I know now that it wasn't. It kept us alive, and it gave us standing, and it was not sufficient. No, she said quietly. It wasn't. Silas stopped. The word seemed to cost him something. He needs a home. Not a house. A person who will make the place where he lives into somewhere he's glad to come back to. Not to serve him. He doesn't need to be served. He needs someone at the table, she said. Silas looked at her. Not across it, she said. At it with him. He was quiet for a long time. Yes, he said finally. That's it exactly. She held his gaze. I'm not going to promise you I'll be easy to live with, she said. I have 17 years of habits that are going to take time to unlearn. I will default to clearing plates and deferring to rooms full of men about things I understand better than they do. I'll catch myself doing it and it'll make me angry, and I might take that out on the wrong person occasionally. She paused. I'm also stubborn. I've been told it's a problem. The corner of Silas's mouth moved barely, but it moved. I've heard stubbornness can run in a family, or find one, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his hat from the table. He turned it in his hands once, the way men turn hats when they've reached the end of something and are deciding how to mark it. I'd like to come back, he said, if that's agreeable. Coffee, and to get to know you properly, not as a prospective anything, just as a person my son has apparently had the sense to care about. She felt something move in her chest that she didn't have immediate language for. That's agreeable, she said. He nodded, put his hat on, and stood. He was halfway to the kitchen door when he stopped and turned back. The thing you said, he said, about being more willing to be wrong about this than anything. I've only felt that way about one thing in my life. He looked at her steadily. It built everything I have. He left. She stood in the kitchen for a moment after the door closed, with the 2 coffee cups on the table and the bread cooling on the rack and the window latched properly. And she put both hands flat on the prep table the way she did when she needed to feel something solid. Then she went back to work. Caleb proposed 6 weeks later in early summer in a way that was so entirely unlike what she'd been braced for that it caught her completely off guard. She'd expected not a grand gesture. She knew him too well for that, but some constructed moment. A specific occasion. The kind of thing a man plans because he's been told that proposals require planning. What happened instead was a Wednesday afternoon when he'd come into town for a legitimate ranch supply run and stopped at the kitchen door with dusty boots and a list in his pocket. And they'd been talking over the prep table about the problem he was having with one of his water agreements with the neighboring property, and she'd said something practical about the language of the original agreement that his foreman had missed. And he'd looked at her for a moment with the pencil still in his hand and said, "Come see the ranch." She looked up. "When now? I mean tomorrow, or whenever." "I want to show you the kitchen." She put down the knife she'd been using to chop roots. "You want to show me the kitchen, not the formal parlor. I want to show you where I actually grew up, where the work happens." He looked at the table. "There's a scarred pine table in there that's been there since before I was born. My father bought it off a freight wagon in the second year of the settlement for $2 silver because it was the sturdiest thing available and he needed a work surface. It's held up." He looked at her. "I want you to see it." She understood what he was asking, not just to visit the ranch. To see the place as it actually was, not the version shown to formal guests, but the worn, real, daily version. The version that said, "This is what my life is actually like, and I'd like to know if you can see yourself in it." "All right," she said. She went the following Saturday when Mrs. Garner had given her the morning off with an expression that suggested she'd been planning this particular morning off for some time. Caleb met her at the edge of town with 2 horses, and she rode she'd learned to ride in her second year in the territory, because not being able to ride had limited her in ways she'd found intolerable, and they went out along the South Road for about 40 minutes, with the summer morning opening up around them, the plains wide and grass yellow and smelling of heat and distance. The ranch house was large in the way of structures built for practical purposes, rather than impression extended over the years, as necessity required, not as aesthetics suggested, which meant it had the comfortable irregularity of a thing that had been genuinely used. A long porch facing east, several outbuildings, a barn that was bigger than the house, cattle visible in the distance as a collective dark shape against the yellow grass. He took her straight to the kitchen. It was a big room, south-facing, with 2 windows and a stove that was industrial-sized in the way of kitchens that fed ranch hands as well as family. The pine table was in the center, and it was exactly as he'd described it, scarred and solid and worn to a particular finish by decades of elbows and knives and the general friction of daily life. She put both hands on it. The wood was warm from the morning sun coming through the south windows. "My mother used to bake at this table," Caleb said. "Or so the cook told me. I don't remember it myself." He stood near the doorway, watching her with his hands in his pockets. "After she died, my father ate in the dining room alone, and I ate in here with the cook. Until I was old enough to tell my father that was a foolish arrangement." She ran her hands along the surface of the table. The grain was deep and visible, the marks of years in it. "Eliza," he said. She looked up. He'd taken his hands out of his pockets, which was unusual for him. He was a hands-in-pockets man when he was thinking. He was looking at her with the same directness he always had, but something else too. Something less composed. "I don't want you on the other side of this table," he said. "I want you sitting at it, with me. I want us to be the people who eat at this table. That's what I want." She looked at him across the pine table that had been there longer than either of them had been alive. "That's a proposal," she said. "It is," he said. "A bad one, probably." I didn't rehearse it. I can tell. Does that?" "I like it better for not being rehearsed," she said. He looked at her. "Is that a yes?" She put her hands flat on the scarred pine surface. "Yes," she said. "With the full understanding that I'm going to be difficult about things I know more about than you. And I'm going to take time to stop defaulting to deferring, and you're going to have it as I come with." "I've been patient since December," he said. "You have," she admitted. "You've been remarkably patient. I've also been right," he said. "For what it's worth." She looked at him for a moment, and then she laughed a real laugh, the kind she didn't produce often, short and slightly surprised. "Don't push it," she said. He crossed the kitchen and stood across the table from her, and she crossed to meet him, and they stood in the middle of the kitchen with the scarred pine table behind them and the south windows, letting in the summer morning, and he held her face in. Both hands the way you hold something you've been careful with for a long time and have finally stopped being afraid of dropping. They were married that fall. The wedding was in October, which was Eliza's choice. She'd wanted the summer to settle the town's reaction to the engagement, the ongoing social reverberations of Founders' Day, the various opinions that had needed time, to either harden into something she could plan for or soften into something that would leave them alone. She was not a woman who made decisions without considering the terrain. The ceremony was small. The practical limitation of having no family to invite and a social landscape that was still in the process of deciding how to regard her meant that small was both appropriate and honest. Mrs. Garner came. Silas stood beside his son with the expression of a man who was trying not to show that he was moved and failing. 2 of Caleb's ranch hands attended because they'd known him for years and he'd asked them personally. Eliza wore a dress that was not gray. She'd made it herself. In the weeks before the wedding, from fabric, she'd chosen carefully a deep blue that she'd never worn before, because the colors she'd worn for most of her adult life had been chosen for practicality and inoffensiveness rather than preference. The blue was her preference. It had taken her 3 weeks to decide she was allowed to have one. She walked to the ceremony alone, which was another honest fact. There was no one to walk her in, and it did not break her. She'd walked most of the important distances of her life alone. She knew how. Caleb watched her come and did not look at anything else. After the ceremony, when they were at the small dinner misses, Garner had organized in the boarding house dining room, the room where Eliza had served meals for 3 years, now the room where she was eating as a guest. Silas raised his cup and said quietly, looking at them both, did well. It was not elaborate. It was Silas Thorne's version of elaborate. Caleb looked at his father. Thank you for coming around. I came around, Silas said, with the particular measured honesty of a man who owns his recalibrations, because she made sense. Eliza looked at her father-in-law across the table. You made sense, he said to her directly. You're the right kind of stubborn. I didn't see it immediately. I should have. You came around, she said. That's what matters. He looked at her with something in his face that was not easy to name, something that had been arranging itself since the Tuesday morning in the kitchen 6 weeks ago, since the conversation about what a home was versus what a house was, since whatever shift had happened in him during the space of 2 coffee cups and an honest exchange. I built a lot of things in this territory, he said. 30 years of building, structures, agreements, operations. He looked at the table. I'm starting to understand that what I actually made was a place for something to happen in. He looked at both of them. I think this is the something. The table was quiet after that, in the way of quiet that doesn't need to be filled. The first months of marriage were not easy in the ways Eliza had predicted, and were difficult in some ways she hadn't. She had warned him about her habits. She'd been accurate. She rose automatically before anyone else and had the kitchen going before she remembered that she wasn't the hired help and that the kitchen was hers and she didn't have to prove anything to it. She deferred, in the first weeks, to every room full of men about things she had firm and well-reasoned opinions on: the water agreement with the neighboring property, the pricing on the fall cattle delivery, the question of whether to repair or replace the east fence line, and then sat with her own deference afterward, like a person who'd done something they disagreed with and couldn't immediately explain why. Caleb noticed. He didn't comment on it immediately, which was its own form of intelligence. He watched it for a few weeks, the pattern of it, and when he understood the shape of what was happening, he didn't tell her she was doing it wrong. He simply stopped asking other people first. He started asking her. What do you think about the east fence? He said one evening, not as an afterthought at the end of a conversation, but at the beginning of one. She told him what she thought, the whole of it, with the reasoning behind it, which she'd been turning over in her mind for 3 days without having been invited to share it. He listened. He didn't interrupt. At the end, he said, That's what I thought, but you said it more clearly. She looked at him. You already knew? I had a sense. I wanted to hear you say it. That she stopped. You're being strategic. I'm trying to establish a pattern, he said, which was honest. I figure if I keep asking you things first, it'll start to feel more natural than the other way. She looked at him for a moment. That's either very clever or slightly manipulative. Probably both, he said. Does it matter? She thought about it. No, she said. I don't think it does. He asked her things first after that. Not every time they were both imperfect people operating in an imperfect situation, and there were days when the ranch work came in like weather, and decisions had to be made fast, and consulting the full partnership was not always practical. But he asked her enough that the habit started to shift. Slowly, with setbacks. There was a dinner in November 6 weeks after the wedding that changed something in a way that neither of them had entirely planned. It was a working dinner. Caleb had 3 ranch hands at the table, plus his foreman, Tom Bauer, who was a competent man in his late 40s with a deep and entirely unmalicious blind spot about women's understanding of cattle operations. They were discussing the winter preparation hay supply, fence assessment, livestock numbers going into the cold months, and it was a dense, detailed conversation with numbers and disagreements, and the particular argumentative energy of people who've worked together long enough to push back on each other without at it turning personal. Eliza had been serving. She'd told herself she was serving because it was a working dinner, and there was a practical logic to it, and it made the table function more efficiently. She was halfway through clearing the first course when she heard something in the fence assessment discussion that was wrong. Not slightly off. Wrong in a way that would cost money and potentially livestock if the decision it was heading toward was made. She stood at the sideboard with a plate in each hand and did not say anything, because the 17-year habit was still right there, still right under the surface. Caleb looked up from the table. He looked at her, not at the conversation. He had the thing in his face that he had when he was reading her, and he read her more accurately than anyone ever had. Eliza, he said. Just her name. Everyone at the table looked at her. She set the plates down on the sideboard. She sat down at the table. In the empty seat at Caleb's left her seat. She knew it was her seat. She'd just been standing at the sideboard instead of occupying it, and she told them what was wrong with the fence assessment. She said it clearly. She cited the numbers she'd heard and the numbers they should be, which she knew from a conversation she'd had with a supply merchant in town 2 weeks ago that no one at this table had thought to have. She explained what the difference meant for the winter preparation. There was a silence at the table. Tom Bauer looked at Caleb. Then he looked at Eliza. Then he looked at the fence numbers in front of him and made the particular expression of a man doing arithmetic that is not resolving the way he expected. She's right, he said, not with enthusiasm, but with the plain fairness of a man who valued accuracy more than winning. I know, Caleb said. Where'd you get the supply figures? Merchant in town, Eliza said, Peters on the south end of the road. He gets the regional pricing 2 weeks before the feed stores. Tom wrote something down. We should be talking to Peters. We should, she agreed. The dinner continued. They adjusted the numbers. The decision that had been heading the wrong direction went the right way. Afterward, when the hands had gone and Tom had ridden back to the bunkhouse, Caleb and Eliza sat at the cleared pine table with the last of the coffee, and she looked at her hands. I almost didn't say anything, she said. I know. That's why I said your name. You can't always do that. You can't always be the one to open the door. No, he agreed. You'll have to start opening it yourself. She looked at the table. The same pine table, the same grain in the wood, the same warmth from the stove. I know, she said. It'll take me time. We have time, he said. She looked at him. He was tired. The ranch winter preparation was relentless, and he showed it, the way the ranch always showed on him, in the depth of the lines at the corners of his eyes, and the way his shoulders held the fatigue of the day. But he was looking at her with the same unhurried attention he'd always given her, since a December morning on a kitchen step, like there was nowhere he was trying to get to, and no version of this he was waiting to arrive at. Tom respected it, she said. It came out slightly surprised. Tom respects useful information regardless of its source. He's practical that way, the others. We'll get used to it. He drank his coffee. They work for us. She absorbed the us the way she'd been slowly absorbing various versions of it, since the wedding is a real thing, not a hypothetical, not a conditional arrangement, but an actual category that she belonged to. It was taking longer than she'd expected to feel true. But it was getting truer. She got up and washed the coffee cups and came back to the table and sat down again. And he didn't remark on her sitting down, just accepted it as the obvious thing, correct thing. And she thought about the distance between that and a boarding house kitchen in December, where she'd sat in a doorway rather than an interior to maintain a threshold, and all the careful incremental steps of the 6 months between then and now. And she felt the full weight of how much ground she had covered, and how much work it had required, and how none of it had been given to her. She had arrived at this table. She had arrived here through her own decisions, starting with the ones she'd made at 17 and continuing through every small act of careful assessment and stubborn forward motion and deliberate choice that had brought her to a scarred pine table in a ranch kitchen in a frontier territory on. A November evening with a cup of coffee and a man who asked her things first. Not rescued, not saved, arrived, she sat at the table. Outside, the first real cold of winter was moving in off the plains with the quiet inevitability of things that have been coming for a long time. Inside, the stove held its heat, the lamp held its light, and for the first time in 17 years, Eliza Merrick, Eliza Thorne now, though the name still sometimes surprised her when she heard, it was exactly where she had decided to be. That was the whole of it, and it was enough, and she was not going to stand up and clear the cups until she was ready. She left them on the table. The first winter was the hardest one. Not because of anything that happened between them, that part, surprisingly, held. But the ranch itself seemed to have been waiting to test her, the way hard country tests everything new that arrives in it, pressing against the edges to find where the weakness is. The cold came in off the plains in December with a seriousness that the old-timers said they hadn't seen in 15 years. And by January, the south water line that Caleb had spent 2 weeks repairing in the fall had frozen solid at the junction and cracked along a 12-foot section that had to be dug out of ground that didn't want to be dug. 3 calves lost in a single week to the cold. A section of east fence that had been borderline all autumn finally gave way under ice weight, and 40 head of cattle spent 2 days wandering a neighboring property before they were all accounted for. Caleb drove himself through all of it with the focused, grinding endurance of a man who had grown up watching his father solve problems by refusing to stop working on them. He was up before light and often not back to the house until after dark, and when he was back, he was tired in the deep way that settles into the bones rather than just the muscles. He ate, he slept. He got up and did it again. Eliza watched him and made calculations. In the boarding house, her role had been defined and bounded. Here are the tasks. Here is the kitchen. Here is the schedule. There was a certain freedom in that boundedness that she hadn't fully appreciated until it was gone. The ranch was different. The ranch was boundless in the way that living things are boundless, always needing something, always presenting the next problem before the last one was resolved, and her role in it was still being defined by both of them in real time, which meant she had to decide every morning what she was and what she could do and where her usefulness lived. Some mornings she got that right. Some mornings she spent 2 hours on something that turned out to be unnecessary while something necessary went undone. She didn't have the ranch's language yet, the specific knowledge of which problems were urgent and which could wait, which tasks Caleb's men handled automatically and which ones fell through the gaps. She was learning it the same way she'd learned everything else in her life, by paying close attention and being willing to be wrong. She was wrong about the hay situation in January. She'd looked at the supply numbers and thought they had enough to carry through to the late thaw. She'd said so to Caleb one evening, clearly, with her reasoning. He'd listened and agreed, and they hadn't ordered additional hay from the merchant on the South Road. 3 weeks later, with the cold extending past every forecast and the cattle burning through feed at a rate the cold temperatures demanded, they were short by a margin that required an emergency order at a premium price that ate a meaningful piece of the winter operating budget. Caleb didn't say, "I told you so." He hadn't told her, so he'd agreed with her assessment. But he also didn't pretend it hadn't happened. "We missed it," he said at the table that evening. "Not you missed it. I missed it," she said. "I read the numbers without accounting for the cold extending past normal. I read the same numbers. I should have caught it too." "Don't do that," she said. He looked at her. "Don't absorb my mistake to make me feel better. I made an assessment and it was wrong. I need to know I made it and own it and understand what I got wrong, or I'll make the same mistake again." She looked at the table. "I don't need protecting from my own errors." He was quiet for a moment. "All right, thank you," she said. "Then I'm sorry about the money. We'll recover it. I know we will. I'm still sorry." He nodded. She could see him absorbing this, the specific dynamic of it, the fact that she was holding herself accountable without spiraling into excessive self-criticism, which was a line she'd had to learn to walk and hadn't always managed. He was learning her edges the same way she was learning the ranch's edges. Neither of them was fully fluent in the other yet. That was fine. Fluency took time. What mattered was that they sat at the table and talked about it directly, and the mistake was named and owned and learned from, and the next morning they both got up and kept going. That, she would later think, was the whole architecture of a functional life together, not the absence of error, but the presence of honesty about error, and the willingness to get up the next morning anyway. Not glamorous, Not the kind of thing anyone tells stories about, but real and solid and worth more than any grand gesture either of them could have offered. The town's opinion shifted more slowly than anything else. This was not unexpected. Eliza had understood from the beginning that the social landscape of Ironwood Crossing was not going to realign itself around a single Founder's Day dance, however significant it had felt from the inside. The machinery of community judgment moves at its own pace and responds to its own evidence, and what it responds to most reliably is time and demonstrated reality. So she waited, she worked. She made herself visible in the ways that were available to her, not performing, not campaigning for approval, but simply existing in the town as a Thorne and doing the things that needed doing and letting the doing speak for itself. The first shift came from an unexpected direction, as first shifts often do. It was March, still cold but beginning to loosen at the edges the way late winter does, when Clara Bauer, Tom Bauer's wife, a woman in her late 30s who had lived in the territory for 15 years and had the quiet, settled manner of someone who'd made her peace with hard country long ago, stopped Eliza on the main street on a Thursday morning and said, without preamble, "Your assessment about the east fence material was right. Tom says we've been using the wrong gauge for years on the property line sections. He's changing over this spring." Eliza looked at her. "I'm glad he found it useful." Clara looked at her with the particular directness of a woman who has no patience for indirect communication. "I'm saying he respects your opinion, which means you're someone he's willing to listen to about ranch matters." In this territory, for a man like Tom Bauer, that's not a small thing. "No," Eliza agreed. "It isn't. I'm also saying," Clara said, "that I was one of the people at the dance who wasn't sure about you." She held Eliza's gaze. "I wanted you to know I've changed my thinking." Eliza stood on the main street of Ironwood Crossing in the late winter cold, looking at a woman who had just done something that Eliza had learned, over the course of her life, was genuinely rare admitted to having been wrong about a person. "That means something," Eliza said. "More than you know." "I thought it might," Clara said. "Coffee sometime." "If you want. I'd like that," Eliza said. It was not a dramatic reconciliation. It was a woman on a cold street saying she'd changed her mind. But it was the first, and it was real. And in the months that followed, it was followed by other firsts, incremental, unannounced, the slow accumulation of small adjustments in the way the town oriented itself toward her. Not everyone. Margaret Whitfield maintained her position with the consistency of a woman who had never once publicly revised an opinion and was not about to begin. Douglas Whitfield's cool, formal distance never completely warmed, though he was no longer actively hostile, which Eliza marked as the closest thing to a concession she was likely to get from that direction. But enough of the town moved toward her, in enough small ways, that by the time the first full spring arrived, she could walk down the main street and exchange genuine words with genuine people and feel, in some new and tender part of herself, like she was allowed to be there. Not invisible, not tolerated there. Silas came to dinner on the first Friday of every month. This had begun somewhat organically. He'd come the Friday after Thanksgiving because the holiday had made the large empty ranch house feel emptier than usual, and Caleb had ridden out to get him. And it had been a good evening, and it had simply continued. By spring, it was a fixed point in the month's calendar, marked in the kitchen log the way supply deliveries and fence inspection dates were marked. He and Eliza had developed, over the winter months, the kind of relationship that doesn't have a clean category name. Not the formal distance of a father-in-law and daughter-in-law navigating each other's company. Not the closeness of family that has known each other for years. Something in between that had its own specific texture, honest, occasionally prickly, built on mutual respect and a shared willingness to say things directly. She challenged him sometimes. She had opinions about the way he'd run certain operations on the ranch in the years before Caleb took over management, and she didn't always keep them to herself. He argued back. He was right sometimes, and she was right sometimes, and on a few occasions they were both partly right, which was the most common outcome when stubborn people argued about complex things. Caleb watched these exchanges with the expression of a man who finds something deeply entertaining but has the wisdom not to say so. In April, over the Friday dinner table, Silas said something that had been sitting in him for a while. Eliza could tell, by the way. He set down his fork and looked at the table before speaking the gesture of a man who has been holding something and has decided it's time to put it down. "I want to say something about the dance," he said. Founders Day. Both Eliza and Caleb looked at him. "I stood at the edge of the yard," he said, when Caleb walked across. When he held out his hand, he looked at Eliza. "I watched you decide. I watched that moment when you put your hand in his." He stopped. "I've been in this territory for 31 years. I've watched a lot of things happen on a lot of occasions. I'm not someone who—" He stopped again. This was costing him something. She recognized the cost. "You don't have to," she said quietly. "I want to," he said. "I stood there, and I watched my son walk past every socially advantageous woman in the territory and cross a yard full of people who were watching him and hold his hand out to a woman they'd been talking about all day. I thought—" He looked at his cup. "I thought his mother would have understood it. The choosing of it, the not caring about the arithmetic of it." He looked at Eliza directly. "She would have liked you. I want you to know that." The kitchen was very quiet. Eliza held his gaze. She felt the full weight of what he'd said, the specific grief in it, the 30 years of missing someone, the way loss reshapes the people left after it and the ways it doesn't. She thought about a boy of 11 eating in the kitchen because the cook was kinder than his father knew how to be, and the father who'd known that and carried it. "Thank you," she said. It was not enough language for what she felt, but it was the true language, and she offered it as such. Silas nodded once, picked up his fork, and returned to his food. Caleb looked at his father for a moment, then at Eliza, then at the pine table, and said nothing. He didn't need to. The three of them sat in the kitchen that had been the real center of the Thorne ranch for 30 years, eating the meal that Eliza had made from scratch. And the evening held all its complications and all its weight and all its quiet rightness simultaneously, the way real things do when they are finally where they belong. The children came. First, a boy they named James after no one in particular, except that it was a name Eliza had always liked the sound of, arrived in the second year of their marriage with a complicated, exhausting, transformative force that first children arrive with. Caleb handled the first weeks with the specific terror of a competent man encountering something his competence has absolutely no purchase on. And Eliza handled it with the specific determination of a woman who had dealt with harder things and was not going to be defeated by something that had been happening to humans since the beginning of humans. She was still not easy about it. James was a difficult infant, loud, demanding, resistant to sleep in a way that suggested he had strong feelings about unconsciousness and was not prepared to concede the point. And there were nights when Eliza sat in the kitchen at 2 a.m. with the baby on her shoulder, both of them worn down past any reasonable point, and thought things about the general situation that she would not have said out loud to anyone. On one such night, Caleb appeared in the kitchen doorway. He'd been out checking on a sick cow, always something, always the ranch presenting its next need, and he came in through the back door with cold air following him, and stopped when he saw her at the table. The baby finally quiet against her shoulder, her eyes at the middle distance of a person who has been awake so long that that consciousness has become a matter of stubbornness rather than wakefulness. "Go to bed," he said. "He'll wake when I put him down. Then I'll sit with him. You've been out for 3 hours. You have the morning feeding to do at 5, Eliza." He crossed the kitchen and took the baby from her shoulder with the slightly more confident handling of a man who'd spent 2 months learning not to hold his son like a piece of evidence. Go to bed. She was too tired to argue and too tired not to feel the full force of what it meant, the presence of someone who simply showed up. Not strategically, not because it was his turn by some calculated arrangement. Just because she was there and she needed it, she went to bed. She was asleep before she'd been there 2 minutes, and she slept 4 hours straight, which was the longest she'd slept since James had arrived. and when she woke in the gray light before dawn, she could hear Caleb in the kitchen talking to the baby in the low, slightly one-sided way he'd developed not baby talk, just regular talking, the ranch, the weather, the fence situation, as if he was briefing a small colleague on the state of operations. She lay in the dark and listened to him, and felt something she'd spent most of her life not allowing herself to feel because it was too close to the edge of things she'd lost or never had. She felt safe, not financially safe, not practically safe. Those were real things, but they weren't this. This was the safety of knowing that if something went wrong at 2 in the morning, someone would show up. Not because they had to, because they wanted to. She'd been on her own for 17 years. She hadn't known that was what was missing because she hadn't known it was possible. She got up at 5 and started the kitchen, and he came in at 5:30 with James asleep in the crook of his arm and the cow tended. And she put coffee on, and he sat at the pine table, and they were quiet together in the early morning the way they'd been quiet on a kitchen step in December. 2 people in the same room, finding that the silence between them was a comfortable one. That was the whole of it. That was what home was, not the building. Not the pine table or the south-facing windows or the stove that held its heat. The silence that didn't need filling. A girl came 2 years after James. They named her Ruth, which was Silas's suggestion, offered quietly over dinner one evening, months before she arrived. It was the name of Caleb's mother, which Silas had never before suggested to anyone for anything. And when he said it, he looked at Eliza rather than at Caleb, which was its own kind of answer to a question that had never been directly asked. She was an easier child than James, or perhaps they were easier parents by then, more calibrated, less startled by each new stage of the thing. Caleb was better with the infant this time, less terrified, more practical. Eliza was better at asking for help, which had been and would continue to be the hardest thing she did on a regular basis. Silas became, in the years of the grandchildren, a different version of himself. It happened gradually, and then all at once, the way certain transformations happen, an accumulation of small adjustments that one day adds up to a person who is recognizably different from who they started as. He came for his Friday dinners and stayed later and later. He arrived sometimes on other days with no stated reason and fixed things. He was his son's father in that respect, and the ranch always had something needing fixing. He sat with James on the porch in the evenings and talked about cattle the way he'd never talked to Caleb's mother about cattle because there hadn't been enough evenings and he hadn't known what he was losing until it was gone. With Ruth, he was different again. She was 4 when she decided that Silas's shoulders were the correct place to sit and informed him of this without requesting his opinion. And he accepted this ruling with the expression of a man who had spent 60 years being firm about things and had finally met something he had no interest in being firm about. He came for Sunday dinners as well eventually. Nobody formally proposed this. It became true the way things become true when they are simply better than the alternative. One Sunday evening, in the 7th year of Caleb and Eliza's marriage, after the children were in bed and Caleb had gone out to check something at the barn, and Silas and Eliza were alone at the kitchen table with the last of the coffee, Silas put his cup down and looked at the room around him. He'd been doing this more lately, looking at rooms, at the ranch, at the settlement, with the particular quality of attention that people develop when they understand they are measuring rather than simply observing. "I want to tell you something," he said. She waited. "When I came here," he said, 31 years ago, with $63 and a dead mule and a freight platform that wasn't even a town, yet I had an idea about what I was building toward. The operation, the water agreements, the standing in the territory." He looked at his hands on the table. "I told myself it was for Caleb, that I was building something to leave him." He paused. "I believed that. I was wrong, but I believed it." She didn't interrupt. "What I was actually building," he said, "was something to fill the space where the other thing should have been. The thing I didn't know how to do after his mother died. I built outward because I didn't know how to build." He stopped, put his hand flat on the pine table, inward, this way. "What you've got here, She looked at the man across from her, this man who had arrived in a territory with nothing and built something out of it through sheer force of will and stubbornness and capacity for work, and who had managed in the process to build everything except the specific thing he'd needed most, and who had found it, finally, at 60-some years old, at a kitchen table on a Sunday evening. "You built the place for it to happen in," she said, echoing what he'd said at their first dinner, years ago. "Yes," he said, "I did, and I'm glad of that." He looked at her. "I'm glad I built it. I'm glad you're in it. I'm glad my son had the sense to—" He stopped. "I'm glad." She looked at him for a long moment. "So am I," she said. He nodded, drank the last of his coffee. They sat in the kitchen together until Caleb came back from the barn, and the evening continued. And eventually Silas put on his coat and hat, and Caleb walked him out to his horse, and Eliza stood in the kitchen doorway, watching them cross the dark yard, the old man and his son, talking about something she couldn't hear. She watched them and felt the specific weight of what she was watching, the history of a family repairing itself in the way that families repair themselves when they're lucky and stubborn and willing, through accumulated evenings and fixed windows and honest conversations and the patient presence of people who choose to stay. Silas died in the 9th year. It was not sudden. It was the kind of dying that announces itself well in advance, the body's gradual unwillingness to keep up with what the person inside it still wants to do. He had 3 months of warning and spent them, as far as anyone could tell, exactly the way he wanted to at the ranch for Sunday dinners, on the porch with James, teaching Ruth to read the weather off the plains with the same careful attention he'd taught everything he knew worth knowing. He did not become sentimental about dying in any obvious way. He was Silas Thorne. Sentimentality was not in his register. What he did was tell the truth, more often and more directly than he'd done in perhaps the entirety of his previous life, as if the narrowing window had clarified what was worth saying. He told Caleb that the water agreements needed renegotiating within 2 years, and here was how to do it, and he told him which of the neighboring ranchers to trust and which ones to be careful with. And he told him that he'd been a better father in the last 9 years than in the first 19, and he was sorry about that. Caleb held the apology without dismissing it or inflating it, which was the right thing to do, and said that the last 9 years had counted, and the first 19 were also over and done, and they'd both had to work with what they'd had. Silas said to Eliza, privately, one afternoon in the month before he died, when they were alone on the ranch porch, with the plains going yellow gold in the late summer light, was this: "I used to think I understood what I'd built here. 31 years of understanding it, I had it categorized." He looked at the land. "You made it something else. We made it something else," she said. "No," he said, with the firmness of a man making a final accounting. Caleb had the sense to choose right. The men who work this ranch are good men, most of them. But what this place became the actual feeling of it, the way it holds people that came from you. He looked at her. "You made a home out of what I only built." She sat with that for a long moment. The plains moved in the summer wind, that ancient restless movement. "You gave us the ground to build it on," she said. "That's not a small thing, Silas." "No," he said, "but it's not the same thing." He died on a Tuesday in early October, peacefully and at the ranch, which was where he'd asked to be. Caleb was there. Eliza was there. James was 9 years old and had been told the truth about what was happening, because Silas himself had told the boy the truth and said that being told the truth was better than being protected from it, which was both accurate and entirely Silas. They buried him on the ranch property, on the east rise where the land opened up, and you could see 3 directions at once. They marked it with a stone. They planted something that would last. The grief was real, and it was long, and it changed shape over the months that followed, the way grief does acute first, then structural, always there but no longer the first thing. Caleb carried it with the same focused endurance he carried hard winters, by going on, by working, by being present for what required his presence. Eliza let herself feel it, which was something she'd learned to do somewhere in the middle of the 9 years that suppressing things for the sake of function was not the same as being strong. She cried in the kitchen, one morning about 6 weeks after, when she was starting the sourdough the same way she'd started sourdough every Friday, since before she'd ever met Caleb Thorne, and something in the routine of it, the familiar. Embodied knowledge in her hands of exactly what to do brought the loss of him up suddenly and completely, and she stood over the prep table and let it happen. Caleb came in, saw her, and didn't say anything. He crossed the kitchen and put his hand on her shoulder and stood beside her for a moment, the way you stand beside someone who is in the middle of something real that doesn't need commentary. Then he poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the table and waited, not impatiently, just present. When she was done, she dried her hands and looked at him. He'd hate us being maudlin about it, she said. He would, Caleb agreed. He'd find it inefficient. She almost laughed. Very inefficient. She went back to the sourdough. He drank his coffee. The kitchen held them both in its warm, scarred, useful way. The railroad station had been standing since the territory's early years, the original structure from which Silas had first operated. The freight platform that had been Ironwood Crossing before Ironwood Crossing was a proper settlement. It had aged into a state of dignified disrepair by the time the question of the dedicated ceremony arose in the settlement's planning meetings, and the question of what to do with it had been debated without resolution for the better part of 2 years. It was Eliza who brought it to the family table. Restore it, she said, at a Sunday dinner in the spring after Silas's death, with James and Ruth at the table and Tom Bauer, who'd become something adjacent to family over the years. And name it. Caleb looked at her. He built this settlement, she said. Not single-handedly, but close enough that this place would not exist without him. He arrived at a freight platform and turned it into somewhere people could live. That deserves to be permanent. She looked at her husband. And he deserves to have his name on something he would recognize. The naming and restoration took the better part of a year. They did it properly, not a quick repair, but a genuine restoration, with attention to the original structure, with materials that matched what Silas had built with. Caleb oversaw it with the same methodical attention to doing things correctly that he brought to everything. Eliza managed the organization of the dedication ceremony because she was now a woman who managed things, who sat at the committee table when there were decisions to be made, who was asked for her opinion on civic matters by the same people who had once speculated about her behind their hands. The settlement had in 9 years found its adjustment. Not everyone had come around. Some people's distance from her remained at the respectful cool of old positions they'd never formally abandoned. But the majority, the working majority, the people who lived alongside them and did business with them and sent their children to play with James and Ruth, had simply integrated her existence into the fact of Ironwood Crossing, which was the most honest form of acceptance available. The morning of the dedication ceremony was a September morning, the kind that carried summer's warmth and autumn's clarity simultaneously, the light clean and sharp as it came off the plains. The platform was full. The restored station stood at the north end of the main street, looking precisely as it should look, older, original, built by hands that knew what they were doing with the Silas Thorne name, engraved on a wooden panel above the main entrance in clear, unpretentious lettering. Not elaborate. He would not have wanted elaborate. Caleb spoke briefly. He was not a man for long speeches, had never been, and his remarks were plain and true and said exactly what needed saying about a man who'd built something from nothing and had found, in the last years of his life, what building was actually for. His voice steadied throughout. Though there was a moment near the end where he stopped for a second, longer than the pause required, and Eliza, standing beside him, touched the back of his hand briefly without drawing attention to it, he finished. The settlement applauded. Afterward, while people were moving toward the food that Clara Bauer and 3 other women had organized on tables along the platform's east side, a fact that would have seemed entirely unremarkable to anyone who hadn't known that Clara Bauer had once been. Among the quietly skeptical, Eliza stood near the station entrance and watched Ironwood Crossing go about the business of celebrating itself. Children ran along the platform edge. Men talked cattle and fencing and the water situation, which was always the water situation in the territory. Women arranged food and managed children, and had the other conversations that happened simultaneously and sometimes more importantly than the ones happening at the surface. She stood and watched and thought about September mornings, about a cattle season dance 7 years before this one, about a gray dress and a stack of platters, and a moment when the question of where she belonged had been answered by someone else with casual cruelty in front of an audience. She thought about the version of herself who had walked into Ironwood Crossing 3 years before that dance, with a letter of introduction and a trunk she could barely carry, and the accumulated habits of 17 years of learning to take up as little space as possible. That woman would not have recognized this morning, would not have been able to imagine standing on this platform as a Thorne, as someone the settlement organized celebrations around, as someone whose opinion shaped civic decisions and whose bread recipe had been copied by half the kitchens in the territory. The distance between then and now was not a gift she'd been given. It was ground she'd walked, and the walking had been real and hard and unglamorous and sometimes wrong, and she would not have traded a yard of it, not even the worst of it, because the worst of it had clarified what was worth fighting for and what wasn't, which was the most useful thing the hard parts of a life can do. She heard the train before she saw it. The afternoon express came through Ironwood Crossing twice a week, and today's timing had arranged itself with the ceremony in a way that was either coincidence or the territory's particular sense of occasion. She heard the whistle from the south end of the track, the familiar approaching sound that always made the platform shift and orient, people turning toward the sound the way people turn toward movement. The train came in slowly, as they always did at the Ironwood Crossing stop, because the platform wasn't long enough for a fast approach. Steam, the mechanical labor of slowing, the clatter and settle of it. People got off. 3, then 4, a family, parents, and 2 children, all of them looking around with the particular exhausted alertness of people who have traveled far and arrived somewhere they are not yet sure about. And then, near the end of the line of disembarking passengers, a young woman. She was perhaps 20, perhaps a little younger. She wore a coat that had been good once and had been used hard since. And she was carrying a trunk, one of the large, battered ones that suggested everything she owned was in it, and she had the trunk by one handle and was managing it with the particular focused effort of a person who is not going to ask for help because asking for help has not historically produced good results. Her eyes moved over the platform quickly, assessing it, assessing the people, assessing the situation she'd arrived in. The eyes of someone trying to read an unfamiliar room while appearing not to do so. Eliza knew those eyes. She knew exactly what was in them because she had worn them for 17 years, the calculation behind a neutral expression, the rapid inventory of who was safe and who wasn't, the determination to appear competent and unneeded, even while needing things, the trained suppression of the most basic human signal, which was, I don't know where I am, and I don't know anyone here. She was moving before she'd decided to move. She crossed the platform at the direct, unhurried pace of someone who knows exactly where they're going, because she did, and she reached the young woman just as the trunk was about to get the better of the situation. Took the other handle. The young woman looked at her with the specific alarm of someone who has learned that unsolicited help usually wants something. I'm Eliza Thorne, she said. This station was built by my father-in-law. Welcome to Ironwood Crossing. The young woman looked at her. She was doing the assessment that Eliza had done on a kitchen step in December long ago, reading the face in front of her for the crack, for the catch, for the thing that was always embedded in an offer. Where are you trying to get to? Eliza asked, a pause. I have a letter. For a woman named Garner. At a boarding house, something moved in Eliza's chest that was quiet and specific and real. I know Mrs. Garner, she said. Come on, I'll take you. They walked off the platform together, the trunk between them, into the September morning of Ironwood Crossing. James was waiting at the edge of the platform where Eliza had told him to stay. He was 10 now, and had inherited both his parents' stubbornness and his grandfather's capacity for assessment. And he was looking at the young woman with the frank, unguarded curiosity of a child who hasn't yet learned that looking at people is considered impolite. "This is my son," Eliza said. "James, take the other side of the trunk." He did, without argument, with the easy willingness of a boy who had been raised in a house where helping was ordinary rather than exceptional, where the question of who carried things was practical rather than positional. Caleb fell in beside Eliza as they moved through the crowd, the way he fell in beside her on most occasions, not to lead, not to follow, just to be there. "New arrival," he said quietly. "She has a letter for Mrs. Garner." He looked at the young woman, then at his wife. "Familiar situation, very," Eliza said. He smiled, the lopsided one that had never become symmetrical and never would, and offered to take his side of the trunk from James. And James relinquished it with the expression of a boy who had been relieved of a task he was managing fine, but was not sorry to have someone else manage for a while. They walked through Ironwood Crossing in the September light. Eliza and Caleb and their son, the young woman and her trunk, the station dedicated to Silas Thorne visible behind them, and the town that had once had very particular opinions about which side of the table Eliza Merrick belonged on went about its day around them. She was not thinking about the town. She was thinking about what she would say to this young woman after she'd had something to eat and a proper night's sleep and was ready to hear something worth hearing. Not advice exactly. She had no interest in instructing anyone on how to live. But there was something she would have wanted someone to tell her, standing on a platform with a too heavy trunk and the trained stillness of someone who had spent years not expecting anything good. She would have wanted someone to tell her, "The place you are standing right now is not the place you will always stand. Not because someone will rescue you from it, because you are going to walk out of it, one careful step at a time. And the walking is yours, and the ground it covers is yours, and nothing about where you started determines where you arrive." That was the thing. That was the whole thing. Not that the world was kind, it wasn't. Not reliably. Not to women who started without resources or standing or family. Not that the right man would appear and fix the landscape. No single person could do that, and expecting them to was its own trap. But that a person's worth was not fixed at birth, not set by circumstance, not sealed by the position they'd been assigned before they understood enough to argue with it. That the table had more than two sides, that there was a difference between being placed somewhere and choosing to stay there. That it was possible, not easy, not guaranteed, not without cost but possible, to walk through a town that once whispered about you and feel the solid ground of your own belonging under your feet. She knew that now. She had walked that ground herself. She had earned every yard of it. Beside her, Caleb said something to James that made the boy laugh, the full, uncomplicated laugh of a child who has grown up in a house where laughter is ordinary. And the young woman with the trunk looked at the sound of it with something in her eyes that Eliza recognized as hope, cautious and new, the kind that arrives when you've been expecting nothing and something unexpectedly fails to be terrible. It was enough to begin with. It had been enough to begin with once. For Eliza Merrick, arriving at a freight platform with a letter and a trunk and 17 years of learned smallness, not yet knowing that the ground she was standing on was the ground where she would build something real. The September morning held them all. The station stood. And Ironwood Crossing, in the particular unhurried way of places that have been built by stubborn people who refuse to stop, continued becoming what it had always been trying to be,